The silence in my apartment had become a physical weight. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of solitude. It was the dead, pressurized silence of an unpaid hydro bill waiting on the counter. For 2 months, I had been treading water in that silence, pretending the floor wasn't about to give way. My severance package had evaporated, eaten by rent and the stubborn, foolish pride that kept me from telling anyone I was failing. Now, the last of it was gone, and the first of the month loomed like a guillotine. I held the lease in my hand, the crisp paper a stark contrast to my clammy palms. 12 pages of legal jargon that boiled down to a single, brutal fact. I was trapped. Breaking it would incur a penalty I couldn't possibly pay, but staying was an even greater impossibility. The document felt like a relic from another life, signed by a version of me who had a career, a future, a naive confidence in the straight line of his own trajectory. That man was a stranger to me now. My gaze drifted to the window. From my small 7th-floor apartment, I had a sliver of a view of the city, a view I'd once found inspiring. Now it just looked expensive. The building itself, the Ashworth, was a quiet monolith of pre-war brick and understated elegance, a place I'd stretched every dollar to afford because it felt safe. Solid. It was owned by one man, a Mr. Julian Croft, a name I only knew from the plaque in the lobby and the occasional, fleeting glimpse of him crossing the marble floor. He was a whisper, a presence, the silent gravity that held this place together. And he lived in the penthouse. Of course he did. He was older, maybe late 40s, with a stillness about him that was more intimidating than any overt display of power. I'd seen him a handful of times, always impeccably dressed in dark, tailored suits that made him seem like a figure carved from shadow and steel. He had graying temples and a face that looked like it had been earned, not given. His eyes, in the brief moments I'd been caught in their path, were a cool, assessing gray. He never smiled, not really. But there was a lack of harshness in his expression that I couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't warmth, but it wasn't coldness either. It was just calm. A deep, unshakable calm that I envied with a fierceness that felt like a physical ache. And now I had to go to him, lease in hand, and confess my failure. I had to stand in front of that quiet authority and admit I couldn't hold up my end of the bargain. The building manager had been sympathetic but firm. Any lease termination had to be approved directly by Mr. Croft. An appointment had been made. 4 o'clock. Penthouse A. My reflection in the dim hallway mirror was a stranger. My cheeks were a little thinner, my eyes a little wider, shadowed with the sleepless nights spent staring at my laptop, sending out resumes into the void. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to tame the nervous energy that made my fingers tremble. I looked young, too young to be this tired. At 28, I felt like I was already starting over, and I hadn't even properly begun. I kept a small, smooth river stone on my nightstand, a silly memento from a trip I'd taken after college, a symbol of permanence I'd once believed in. I'd picked it up and held it before leaving the apartment, its cool weight a small, solid anchor in the churning sea of my anxiety. It was in my pocket now, a secret ballast. I needed every bit of grounding I could get. The ride up in the elevator was silent and swift. The regular, oak-paneled car I used every day went to the 12th floor. For the penthouse, you needed a key, which the concierge had used to grant me access. The elevator that arrived was different. Lined in dark, polished mahogany with a single, discreet brass rail, it felt less like a utility and more like a private chamber. It smelled faintly of leather and something else, something clean and dry like old paper. It smelled like money, I supposed. The quiet, generational kind, not the loud, flashy sort. The doors opened directly into a private foyer. There was no hallway, just a single, massive door of dark wood. A small, understated plaque read simply, "Croft." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I took a breath, then another, straightened the collar of my worn but clean shirt, and knocked. The sound was swallowed by the silence. I waited. For a moment, I thought perhaps he wasn't there, that I'd been forgotten. A part of me, the cowardly part, desperately hoped so. Then, the lock clicked, a heavy, satisfying sound, and the door swung inward. Mr. Julian Croft stood there, and the reality of him was more potent than the fleeting glimpses in the lobby. He was taller than I'd realized, broad-shouldered in a way his suits concealed. He wasn't wearing one now. Instead, he had on a simple gray cashmere sweater and dark trousers. No tie, no armor. His hair was slightly mussed, as if he'd been running a hand through it. The assessing gray eyes found mine, and for a second, I forgot how to breathe. "Mr. Evans," he said. His voice was just as I'd imagined it would be from his bearing. A low baritone, smooth and even, with a quiet resonance that seemed to settle in the air. It wasn't a question. He knew who I was. "Mr. Croft." I managed, my own voice sounding thin and reedy. "Thank you for seeing me." I held up the lease, the paper trembling slightly in my grip. I need to talk to you about this." He didn't look at the document. His eyes stayed on my face, and his gaze was steady, unblinking. It wasn't unkind, but it was intensely focused, as if he were reading the fine print of my soul. I felt utterly transparent, my failure laid bare before I'd even spoken a word of it. He stepped back, holding the door open wider. "Come in, Leo," he said, using my first name. The sound of it in his mouth was startling, a sudden shift from formal to personal that threw me off balance. "Let's talk in my study." His apartment was quiet. That was the first word that came to mind. It wasn't empty or sterile, but it was filled with a profound sense of peace. The foyer opened into a vast living space with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the entire city. The furniture was a mix of modern and antique, all of it tasteful and understated. There were books everywhere, not just on shelves, but in neat stacks on side tables and on the floor next to a worn leather armchair. It felt like a home, a sanctuary. He led me down a short hallway into a study that was lined from floor to ceiling with books. A massive mahogany desk sat before another large window, but he didn't go behind it, didn't create that barrier of power. Instead, he gestured to two comfortable-looking armchairs near a cold fireplace. "Please," he said, waiting for me to sit before taking the chair opposite. The space between us felt both intimate and immense. I sat on the edge of the cushion, my back ramrod straight, the lease held in my lap like a shield. "Mr. Croft, I'll be direct. I've lost my job. I can no longer afford the rent here. I need to break my lease." The words came out in a rush, a clumsy, painful confession. I braced myself for the response, the sigh of annoyance, the lecture on responsibility, the cold calculation of penalties owed. He just watched me, his expression unreadable. He steepled his fingers, resting his chin on them for a moment. The silence stretched, thick with my own shame. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, devoid of any judgment. "I see," he said. "And where will you go?" The question caught me by surprise. It wasn't about the money or the contract. It was about me. I don't know yet," I admitted, the truth of it landing hard in my own chest. "A cheaper place. Further out. I'll figure it out." "The penalty for breaking the lease is 2 months' rent," he stated, not as a threat, but as a simple fact. I nodded, my throat tight. "I know. I don't have it. But I would pay you back. In installments. As soon as I find a new job." It sounded pathetic even to my own ears. A flimsy promise from a man who couldn't even pay his next month's rent. He was silent again, his gaze dropping to the lease in my hands, then returning to my face. I could feel a flush creeping up my neck. I felt like a child, asking for an allowance. The power imbalance was a chasm between us, and I had never been more aware of my own precarious position. "Tell me about your previous work, Leo," he said, his tone shifting slightly. It was a gentle inquiry, not an interrogation. "I was an archivist," I said, surprised into an honest answer. "For a private art foundation. Cataloging, research, digital preservation." The foundation lost its primary benefactor. They had to downsize drastically. He nodded slowly, a flicker of something. Interest? Recognition? In his eyes. "You're detail-oriented. Organized. You have a respect for history, for the story that objects can tell." It wasn't a question. It was an observation, and a startlingly accurate one. "Yes," I said, a little breathless. "I suppose so." He leaned forward slightly, the cashmere of his sweater shifting. The air in the room seemed to warm by a degree. "I have a proposition for you. It is not an act of charity, but a straightforward business arrangement. Should you choose to decline, we will find an amicable way to dissolve your lease. There will be no penalties." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process his words. No penalties? An amicable dissolution? It was more than I could have possibly hoped for. But the other part, a proposition. What kind of proposition? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He rose from his chair and walked over to a section of the bookshelf. He pressed a panel, and a portion of the wall swung inward, revealing another door. My eyes widened. He unlocked it and pushed it open, revealing not another room, but a spiral staircase leading down. This building has its secrets, he said, a faint, almost imperceptible hint of a smile touching his lips for the first time. My grandfather was a collector. Of books, mostly. First editions, manuscripts, forgotten histories. When he passed, his collection came to me. It's stored in a sealed apartment on the floor below this one. It has been sitting there for a decade, untouched. It's a disorganized mess. It needs to be inventoried, cataloged, and appraised for insurance. It requires a professional, someone with your specific skill set. He turned back to face me, his gray eyes holding mine. The calm in them was still there, but now it was underpinned by something else. An intensity, a purpose. I will offer you a temporary contract, he said, his voice even and direct. You would work here, in the building. I will pay you a salary that is more than sufficient to cover your rent and living expenses for the duration of the project. I anticipate it will take 3, perhaps 4 months. You would keep your apartment. Your debt would be cleared. When the project is complete, you will have a significant financial cushion and a recent, impressive entry on your resume. And you will be free to go, or to stay, as you see fit. I was speechless. My mind reeled, trying to find the catch, the hidden clause. This man, this near stranger, was offering me a lifeline so perfect, so tailored to my exact circumstances, that it felt like something out of a dream. He was using his resources to create a space for me, a solution that wasn't a handout, but an opportunity. It preserved my dignity while solving my every immediate problem. Why? I finally asked, the single word hanging in the quiet space between us. Julian Croft walked back to his chair, but didn't sit. He stood before me, a solid, grounding presence. The weight of his gaze was not heavy, but it was significant. It made me feel seen. Because I have a collection that needs an archivist, he said simply. And you are an archivist in need of a collection. It is a logical symbiosis. He paused, and his expression softened almost imperceptibly. And because it is a waste to see good talent go adrift. He held out his hand, not for the lease, but for me to shake. The choice is yours, Leo. There is no pressure. I looked from his outstretched hand to his steady gray eyes. The fear that had been my constant companion for weeks began to recede, replaced by a fragile, fluttering thing I barely recognized. Hope. I placed my trembling hand in his. His grip was firm and warm, his skin dry. It was a handshake, nothing more, but it felt like a promise. A foundation settling into place. I accept, I said. He held my hand for a beat longer than necessary, his thumb brushing lightly against my knuckles. A small, almost invisible gesture that sent a jolt of warmth through me. Then he let go. He took the lease from my lap, and I expected him to file it, to put it away as a symbol of our new agreement. Instead, he walked over to the cold fireplace. He took the 12-page document, and with a single, deliberate motion, he tore it in half, then in half again. He dropped the pieces onto the grate. Your old contract is terminated, he said, turning to face me, his expression clear and resolute. We will draw up a new one. For your employment, your tenancy is no longer conditional on rent. It is conditional on you showing up tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. I could only nod, my throat too thick with emotion to speak. He hadn't just offered me a job. He had torn up the evidence of my failure. He had wiped the slate clean, and in its place, he had built a bridge. I just had to find the courage to walk across it. The next morning, I woke before my alarm. The usual knot of anxiety in my stomach was gone, replaced by a thrumming, nervous energy. I was still broke, still technically unemployed in the traditional sense, but the world felt different. The silence in my apartment was no longer oppressive. It was just quiet, a space to think. I dressed with more care than I had in months, choosing a simple button-down shirt and dark jeans. It felt strange to be getting ready for work that was just an elevator ride away. There was no commute, no jostling crowd on the subway, just the quiet ascent to the top of the building where my new, strange reality waited. Punctually at 9, I knocked on the penthouse door. It opened almost immediately, as if he had been waiting on the other side. Mr. Croft was dressed for business today, in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, though he wore no tie. He looked powerful, in command, yet the quiet calm was still there, an immovable center to his being. "Good morning, Leo," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the air. "Coffee?" "Yes, please," I said, following him into the kitchen. It was a chef's dream, all stainless steel and dark granite, but like the rest of the apartment, it felt used and comfortable. A well-loved espresso machine hissed on the counter. He moved with an economy of motion, pulling a cup and saucer from a cabinet, preparing the coffee without any wasted effort. It was a simple act, but I found myself watching his hands. They were large and capable, with long fingers. The hands of a man who could build things or tear them down with equal precision. He handed me the cup. It was a small, heavy ceramic thing, and the coffee was dark and fragrant. "The employment contract is on the desk in the study," he said, leaning against the counter as he sipped his own. "Read it carefully. I've had my lawyer draft it to be as straightforward as possible. Your salary, your hours, the scope of the project. It also contains a confidentiality clause. My grandfather was a private man." I nodded, taking a sip of the coffee. It was strong and smooth, and the warmth spread through my chest. "I understand. My office is downtown," he continued. "I am typically there most of the day. You will have this floor and the library to yourself. My housekeeper, Maria, comes on Tuesdays and Fridays. She will not disturb you. If you need anything, my personal number is in the contract. Do not hesitate to use it." He was laying out the boundaries, creating a professional space for me within his personal one. It was a gesture of respect I hadn't expected. He was making it clear that while I was working in his home, I was not his servant. I was his employee, and my autonomy was important. In the study, I read the contract. It was exactly as he'd said, clear, fair, and surprisingly generous. The salary was almost double what I had been making at the foundation. The hours were flexible. The project's scope was well-defined. It was the kind of contract you dream of. I signed it without a moment's hesitation. When he returned to the study, I handed him the signed copy. He glanced at my signature, then slid the document into a folder on his desk. "Good," he said. "Let's get you started." He led me to the hidden door and down the spiral staircase. The air grew cooler as we descended, and the scent of old paper and dust grew stronger. The staircase ended in what looked like a service corridor, and at the end of it was a heavy, steel door with a keypad lock. He punched in a code, and the door hissed open. The space within was breathtaking. It was a full apartment, but it had been stripped of most of its furnishings. Every available surface was covered in books. They were in teetering stacks on the floor, crammed into makeshift shelving, and overflowing from wooden crates. It was chaos, but it was a beautiful chaos. The air was still and thick with the smell of aging leather and vanilla-scented lignin, the perfume of forgotten stories. Sunlight streamed through a large, grimy window, illuminating dancing dust motes. "This is it," Julian said, his voice softer in this space. "The collection. As you can see, it is in a state of profound neglect." I walked slowly into the room, my fingers itching to touch, to organize, to discover. It wasn't just a mess, it was a treasure trove. I could see the spines of leather-bound volumes, the faded gilt of titles and languages I didn't recognize. It was an archivist's paradise. "It's incredible," I breathed. "It's a fire hazard," he countered, though the corner of his mouth twitched. "There are supplies in the kitchen. Archival boxes, labeling materials, a laptop connected to a database I had set up. The methodology is yours to determine. You are the expert here." He was giving me complete control. The trust he placed in me was both exhilarating and terrifying. I felt a surge of purpose, a feeling that had been absent for so long. This was not just a job, it was a responsibility. A legacy had been placed in my hands. "I'll start by sorting," I said, already thinking, planning. "Group by subject, then by condition. We need to triage the most fragile items first." "Good," he said, his gaze sweeping over the room, then landing on me. There was something in his eyes, a flicker of satisfaction. "I will leave you to it. I have a meeting I cannot miss." He paused at the door. "Leo," I turned to face him. "Yes." "Lunch," he said. "There is a small cafe around the corner, the Gilded Spoon. They make an excellent sandwich. I've set up an account for you there. Just give them your name." And then he was gone, the heavy door clicking shut behind him, leaving me alone in the quiet, dusty silence of the library. It was another small, considerate gesture, another way of providing for me without making it feel like charity. He wasn't just giving me a salary. He was ensuring I was comfortable, cared for. It was a quiet act of protection, and it settled deep inside me, a steadying warmth. The first few days were a blur of focused, satisfying work. I lost myself in the rhythm of it. The careful lifting of a heavy tome, the gentle brush to remove decades of dust, the meticulous entry of data into the laptop. I created a system, a workflow, and slowly, order began to emerge from the chaos. A corner of the large room became my staging area, with neat stacks of books sorted by genre and condition, each with a small, handwritten tag. I rarely saw Julian. He left early in the morning, before I arrived, and usually returned late in the evening, after I had gone back down to my own apartment. But his presence was a constant, quiet hum in the background of my life. Sometimes I would find a fresh bottle of water and a piece of fruit left on the kitchen counter in the library apartment, a silent offering. One afternoon, I found a brand new ergonomic chair waiting for me, replacing the stiff wooden one I had been using. There was no note, no explanation. There didn't need to be. I began to learn about him through his grandfather's books. The collection was eclectic, revealing a man of vast and varied interests. There were first editions of classic literature, of course, but also obscure texts on botany, astronomy, and ancient cartography. Tucked inside a worn copy of Moby Dick, I found a faded photograph of a young boy with serious gray eyes, standing on a sailboat. It was unmistakably Julian. In another book, a collection of poetry, I found a pressed flower and an inscription on the title page in a spidery, elegant hand, "For my Julian. May you always find your own true north." It wasn't signed. These small discoveries felt intensely private, like I was piecing together the puzzle of the quiet, solitary man who lived upstairs. I felt a growing sense of connection to him, a strange intimacy forged in the silence of his family's history. My initial awe of him was slowly being replaced by a deep, burgeoning curiosity. I found myself wondering about him constantly. What did he think about during his long days downtown? Did he ever feel lonely in that vast, quiet penthouse? What did he do on the weekends? One evening, I worked later than usual, completely absorbed in a particularly fascinating set of hand-drawn maps of the New England coastline from the 18th century. I didn't realize how much time had passed until I heard the faint sound of the keypad on the door. I looked up, startled, as Julian entered. He stopped in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He had loosened his tie, and his suit jacket was slung over his shoulder. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes more pronounced. "I didn't mean to disturb you," he said, his voice low. "You're not," I said quickly, my heart rate kicking up a notch. It was the first time we had been alone in this space since that first day. I lost track of time. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the progress I had made. The neat stacks, the labeled boxes, the clear pathways I had carved through the clutter. A faint look of approval crossed his features. "You've done good work, Leo," he said. "More than I expected in such a short time." "I enjoy it," I said, and it was the honest truth. "It's peaceful." He walked further into the room, stopping at the table where I had the maps spread out under a soft light. He looked at them for a long moment, his hands in his pockets. "My grandfather loved the sea," he said, his voice laced with a hint of nostalgia. "He taught me how to sail on a boat not much bigger than this table. He said it was the only place a man could feel truly free and truly at the mercy of something greater than himself at the same time." He looked up from the maps and met my gaze. The professional distance between us seemed to dissolve in the quiet, dusty air of the library. In that moment, he wasn't my employer, the wealthy owner of the building. He was just a man, talking about his grandfather. "He would be pleased with what you're doing here," Julian said, bringing his passion back to life. A warmth bloomed in my chest, a feeling of pride that was sharp and sweet. "Thank you," I said softly. We stood there in a comfortable silence for a moment, the only sound the faint hum of the city outside the window. I became acutely aware of our proximity, the few feet of air that separated us. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne, a subtle mix of sandalwood and something else I couldn't place. It was the same scent that lingered in the private elevator. You should go home, he said finally, his voice gentle. It's late, right? I said, starting to gather my things. As I reached for my notebook, my elbow bumped a small, precarious stack of books I had set on the edge of the table. They wobbled, and I lunged to catch them, but my reflexes were too slow. Before they could crash to the floor, Julian's hand shot out, his arm brushing against mine. He steadied the stack with an easy, confident movement. His fingers were long and warm where they covered the back of my hand, pressing it against the cool, dry leather of the top book. The touch was electric. A simple, accidental contact, but it sent a shockwave through my entire system. My breath hitched in my throat. I looked up at him, and his eyes were dark, his gaze intense. He didn't move his hand right away. For a long, breathless second, we were frozen there, his hand covering mine, the air crackling with an unspoken tension. The weight of his gaze was a physical thing. I could feel it on my skin, a soft pressure that made my pulse race. The world seemed to narrow to that single point of contact, the warmth of his skin against mine. It was the most significant touch I had experienced in years, and it was over in a matter of seconds. He slowly withdrew his hand, his expression unreadable once more. Careful, he said, his voice a low murmur. Sorry, I mumbled, my face burning. I felt clumsy, foolish. Don't be, he said. It's my fault for startling you. He took a small step back, creating distance between us again. The air rushed back into the space, cool and empty. Have a good night, Leo. You too, Mr. Croft, I said, my voice sounding strained. Julian, he corrected me gently. My name is Julian. And with that, he turned and left, leaving me alone with the ghost of his touch on my skin and the echo of his name in the silent room. I stood there for a long time, my hand resting on the books, my heart hammering against my ribs. Something had shifted between us. A line had been crossed, not in action, but in feeling. The quiet foundation of our professional arrangement had just developed its first hairline crack, and I had no idea if it was the beginning of a collapse or the start of something being built. The next week was defined by a subtle, careful dance. We didn't speak of the moment in the library, but it hung in the air between us, a silent, shared memory. Julian started leaving his study door open when he was home in the evenings. It was a small change, but it felt significant. An invitation. Sometimes, as I packed up for the day, I would hear the soft strains of classical music drifting down the spiral staircase. It made the vast penthouse seem less empty, less intimidating. It made him seem less distant. I began to analyze his every small action, searching for meaning. When he passed me in the lobby, his usual brief nod was now accompanied by a softer look in his eyes, a gaze that lingered for a beat too long. One morning, I rode up in the elevator with him. We stood in a comfortable silence, but I was intensely aware of him beside me, the solid presence of his shoulder just inches from my own. I could smell that sandalwood scent again, and I had to consciously focus on my breathing to keep it even. He was a man of routines, I learned. He had coffee at the same time every morning. He read the physical newspaper, never a tablet. He had a standing call with his London office every Tuesday afternoon, and I could sometimes hear the low, confident murmur of his voice through the floor. I was gathering these small details, these fragments of his life, and hoarding them like treasure. I was building a portrait of him in my mind, a portrait that was becoming increasingly, dangerously, dear to me. The work in the library progressed steadily. I had cleared the main room and was now starting on the small, adjoining study. It was in this room that I found the journals. They were tucked away in a locked desk drawer, which I managed to open with a key from a forgotten ring I found in a dusty box. There were a dozen of them, leather-bound and filled with his grandfather's elegant, looping script. My professional ethics screamed at me to close the drawer and pretend I hadn't seen them. They were private. They were not part of the collection to be cataloged. But a deeper, more human curiosity compelled me. I told myself I was just checking for any signs of mildew or insect damage. It was a flimsy excuse. I opened one. The entry was dated 50 years ago. It spoke of business, of travel, of the weather. But then, a few pages in, a different tone emerged. He wrote of his wife, Julian's grandmother, with a tenderness and a depth of love that made my throat ache. He wrote about his son, Julian's father, with a mixture of pride and frustration. And he wrote about Julian. He described a quiet, serious boy who preferred the company of books to other children. A boy who felt things deeply but rarely showed it. He has a good heart, one entry read, but he builds walls to protect it. I worry he will spend his life in a fortress of his own making. I closed the journal, my hands trembling slightly. I felt like a trespasser, a voyeur, but I also felt a profound sense of understanding. The quiet, solitary man upstairs was still that serious boy, living in his fortress. His calm wasn't a lack of feeling, it was a carefully constructed defense. And I, for some reason, had been allowed a glimpse inside the gates. That evening, I was determined to push a little, to test the new, fragile dynamic between us. As I was leaving, I saw through his open study door that he was staring out the window at the city lights, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked impossibly lonely. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, my heart in my throat. Then, I took a breath and walked to the doorway of his study. "Julian," I said softly. He turned, his expression surprised, but not unwelcoming. "Leo, I thought you had left." "I was just going," I said. I just wanted to say thank you." He raised an eyebrow, a gesture of quiet inquiry. "For what?" "For this," I said, gesturing vaguely to indicate the job, the apartment, everything. "You didn't have to do it." He took a slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes never leaving my face. "Yes, I did," he said, his voice low and certain. The words hung in the air, imbued with a meaning that went far beyond our professional arrangement. My mind raced. What did he mean? That he had to because of some sense of duty? Or that he had to because of me? "I'm glad you're here," he added, his voice so soft it was almost a whisper. It was a simple statement, but it felt like a monumental confession. It was a crack in the fortress wall. "This is it," I thought. "This is the moment. You can retreat back down the stairs to the safety of your own apartment, or you can step forward." I stepped forward. I walk into the room, stopping a few feet from him. The space is charged, electric. I can feel the soft gravity of his presence pulling me closer. "I'm glad I'm here, too," I say, my voice steady despite the frantic beating of my heart. We just look at each other for a long moment. The city twinkles below us, a silent witness. The quiet foundation of our relationship is shifting, the ground beneath my feet rearranging itself into a new, uncertain landscape. And for the first time in a very long time, I am not afraid of the fall. I am only afraid of not jumping. The breakthrough came during a task that was both mundane and monumental. Assembling a new set of custom-built, climate-controlled shelving units that had been delivered for the most valuable books in the collection. The instructions were a labyrinth of German engineering, and the pieces were heavy and awkward. I had been struggling with the first one for an hour before Julian appeared at the top of the spiral staircase. "It would appear," he said, his voice dry with a hint of amusement, "that you require a second set of hands." He had changed out of his suit and was wearing a soft, dark blue Henley that stretched across his shoulders. He rolled up the sleeves, revealing strong, capable forearms dusted with fine, dark hair. My mouth went a little dry. "It would appear so," I admitted, trying to sound casual. For the next 3 hours, we worked together. Side by side, we fell into an easy, unspoken rhythm. I would read the infuriatingly obtuse instructions, and he would hold the heavy pieces in place while I fitted them together. Our hands brushed against each other countless times. A graze of knuckles as we both reached for the same screw. The warmth of his fingers briefly covering mine as he passed me a tool. Each touch was accidental, perfunctory, and yet each one sent a fresh jolt through my nervous system. We didn't talk much, but the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with the small sounds of our shared task, the scrape of metal on wood, the whir of the electric screwdriver, our synchronized breathing as we lifted a heavy shelf into place. We were a team, equals. In this small, shared project, the vast difference in our age and our wealth seemed to melt away, leaving just two men, working together to build something. When the first unit was finally complete, standing tall and solid against the wall, we stepped back to admire our handiwork. A thin sheen of sweat glistened on Julian's forehead, and a smudge of dust marked his cheek. He looked younger, more relaxed than I had ever seen him. "Not bad," he said, a genuine, small smile touching his lips. It transformed his entire face, softening the severe lines and making his gray eyes seem to warm from within. Not bad at all. I agreed, my own smile feeling wide and real. We should quit our day jobs and go into the flat-pack furniture assembly business. He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate right through me. I think I'll stick to finance. It's considerably less hazardous. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand, leaving a faint streak of dust. Without thinking, I reached out and gently brushed the smudge from his cheek with my thumb. My fingers were slightly calloused from the work, and the skin of his face was smooth and warm. The moment my thumb touched his skin, the light, easy atmosphere between us evaporated, replaced by that same intense, crackling tension from the other night in the library. My hand froze. His smile faded, his eyes darkening as they fixed on mine. His breath hitched, a tiny, almost imperceptible sound. I should have pulled my hand away. I should have apologized, made a joke, broken the spell. But I couldn't. I was mesmerized by the feeling of his skin under my thumb, by the sudden vulnerability in his expression. The fortress walls were gone. It was just him, just Julian. Slowly, I let my hand drop back to my side. The air was thick with everything we hadn't said. "Leo," he said, his voice raspy. "I know," I whispered, though I wasn't entirely sure what I knew. I only knew that this feeling, this powerful, magnetic pull between us, was real. He took a half step toward me, then seemed to catch himself. He took a deep, steadying breath and stepped back, re-establishing the space between us. The walls went back up, but I had seen behind them. I knew what was there. "I should," he started, then trailed off. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I was beginning to recognize as a sign of his own uncertainty. I need to be clear about something. I braced myself. Here it comes, I thought. The speech about professionalism, about boundaries, about not misinterpreting his kindness. "This arrangement," he said, gesturing to the room, "to the books, it's a job, a contract. It has a beginning and an end. It is important to me that you always feel you have a choice, that you are here because you want to be, not because you feel obligated. Your presence in this building, in my life, it is not a condition of your employment." He was looking at me with a raw, startling honesty. He wasn't pushing me away. He was doing the opposite. He was naming the power imbalance between us, putting it on the table, and making sure I knew it didn't control me. He was worried about being seen as coercive, as controlling. He was worried about me. "Julian," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. "I have never felt obligated. Not for a single moment." Relief washed over his features, a subtle softening of the tension in his jaw. "Good," he said quietly. He looked at me for a moment longer, his gray eyes searching my face. He opened his mouth as if to say more, then seemed to think better of it. "It's getting late," he said instead. "We can finish the other units this weekend, if you're free." It was a question that felt like an open door, not a test. It wasn't an order from an employer. It was an invitation. "I'm free," I said. "I'd like that." "Good," he said again. "I'd like that too." He left then, and I stood for a long time in the quiet room, my thumb still tingling from the memory of his skin. He had shown me his vulnerability, his concern for my autonomy. He had handed me the power to define our relationship, to walk away at any time. And in doing so, he had bound me to him more tightly than any contract ever could. The weekend arrived with a sense of quiet anticipation. The professional veil between us had been irrevocably thinned. When Julian came down to the library on Saturday morning, he was dressed in jeans and a simple t-shirt. It was the most casual I had ever seen him, and it made him seem more approachable, more real. We worked on the shelves all day, the easy rhythm from before returning quickly. We talked more this time. Not about anything deep or personal, but about books, about music, about the city. I learned he had a dry sense of humor that appeared in quiet, unexpected moments. He learned that I was a terrible cook and that I had a secret love for old, black and white movies. It was a slow, careful exchange of small, personal details, each one a thread being woven into a tapestry of connection. Late in the afternoon, we finished the last shelf. We stood back, sweaty and tired, admiring the 3 beautiful, solid units that now lined the wall, ready to house the most precious parts of the collection. "I believe this calls for a celebration," Julian said. "Are you hungry?" "Starving," I admitted. "I'll order a pizza," he said. "My treat." To thank my coworker for his hard labor, the teasing note in his voice made me smile. We ate sitting on the floor of the library, the pizza box between us, leaning against the wall. The late afternoon sun streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the room. It felt comfortable, domestic. It felt right. So what happens now? I asked, breaking the comfortable silence. With the library, I mean. Now, the real work begins, he said. Now, we fill the shelves. He looked at the empty units, then at me. It will be a shame to see this project end. My heart gave a painful lurch. He was talking about the work, but it felt like he was talking about us. The temporary nature of our arrangement, a fact I had tried to keep pushed to the back of my mind, was suddenly front and center. In a month or two, the job would be done. I would have money in my pocket and a good reference. And I would have no reason to be here anymore. The thought was unbearable. The tipping point came a week later, not from within the quiet sanctuary of the penthouse and the library, but from the outside world. I was collecting my mail in the lobby when one of the other tenants, a woman named Mistress Gable who had lived in the building for 30 years and knew everyone's business, stopped me. "Leo, dear," she said, her eyes bright with a curiosity that bordered on interrogation. "I see you've been spending a great deal of time upstairs. Mr. Croft is such a private man. It's lovely to see he's finally taken someone under his wing." The phrase, "under his wing," landed like a stone in my gut. It dripped with condescension, with assumptions about our relationship. It painted me as a charity case, a pet project for the wealthy, solitary landlord. I felt my face flush with a mixture of anger and shame. "I'm working for him," I said, my voice stiffer than I intended. "On a temporary contract." "Oh, of course, dear," she said, patting my arm in a way that was meant to be motherly but felt deeply patronizing. "Whatever you say. It's just nice to see him with some company." I retreated to my apartment, her words echoing in my ears. This was what people would think. It was the logical conclusion. A young, struggling man and an older, wealthy one. The dynamic was ripe for misinterpretation, for ugly gossip. And the worst part was, I couldn't even say she was entirely wrong. I wasn't just his employee. I was something else. Something undefined and terrifying and wonderful. But how could I ever expect the world to see that? How could I expect Julian to want that kind of scrutiny? The encounter left me feeling raw and exposed. My old insecurities, my fears about the power imbalance, came rushing back. I started to pull away. I kept my hours strictly professional, leaving exactly at 5 each day. I avoided any opportunity for conversation, keeping my answers to his questions polite but brief. I was building my own walls, trying to protect myself from a hurt that hadn't even happened yet. Julian, being perceptive, noticed the change immediately. The warmth in his gaze was replaced by a look of confusion, of concern. He didn't press me, but I could feel his quiet, questioning presence every time we were in the same room. The air between us, once charged with possibility, was now thick with unspoken tension. A few days later, he came down to the library as I was packing up. He didn't say anything at first, just stood in the doorway, watching me. I could feel his eyes on my back. "Leo," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "Talk to me." I kept my back to him, pretending to organize a stack of books. "There's nothing to talk about." "Don't lie to me," he said, and there was a hard edge to his voice I had never heard before. It wasn't angry, but it was commanding. "I'm not a fool. Something is wrong. You've been distant all week. If I've done something to offend you, I expect you to tell me." I finally turned to face him. He looked tired, and there was a deep line of worry between his brows. The sight of it broke through my carefully constructed defenses. "It's not you," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "It's me. It's the what people will think." Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a flicker of something that looked like pain. "Mistress Gable," he said. It wasn't a question. I just nodded, my throat too tight to speak. He closed the distance between us in 2 long strides. He stopped right in front of me, so close I could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes. He didn't touch me, but his proximity was a powerful statement. He wasn't retreating. "Does it bother you?" he asked, his voice low and intense. What a lonely, bored woman might say. "It bothers me that she might be right," I admitted, the words tearing out of me. "Not about the details, but about the dynamic. Hear you. And I'm me. And I'm living in your building and working in your home and taking your money. And I can't stand the thought of anyone thinking I'm just." I couldn't finish the sentence. "What?" he prompted gently. Thinking you're what? That I'm using you, I whispered. Or that you're taking advantage of me. Julian's expression hardened, but the anger wasn't directed at me. It was directed at the ugliness of the assumption. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air for a moment before he gently cupped my jaw. His thumb stroked my cheek, a gesture that was both possessive and incredibly tender. "Look at me, Leo," he commanded softly. I met his gaze. "The only person in this room who is taking advantage of anyone is me. I am taking advantage of your talent, your passion, your hard work. You have brought this place." He gestured to the now organized library, back from the dead. "You have given me a connection to my family's history that I thought was lost. Any debt that existed between us was paid in your first week here." His eyes held mine, and the force of his sincerity was staggering. "I do not care what Mistress Gable thinks. I do not care what anyone in this building or this city thinks. I only care about what you think." He paused, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw. "And what you want." The loaded question hung in the air between us. "What do you want?" He was giving me the floor, giving me the power, asking for my consent not just for a moment, but for the future. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a wild, frantic drumbeat. All my fears, all my insecurities, seemed to pale in comparison to the truth that was standing right in front of me. The truth in his eyes, the truth in his touch. "I want this," I said, my voice shaking but clear. "I want you." A slow, beautiful smile spread across Julian's face. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated relief. "Good," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "Because I am exceptionally tired of pretending I don't want the same thing." The confession hung in the air, a perfect, shimmering note in the quiet of the library. All the unspoken tension, the yearning, the weeks of careful observation and cautious steps forward had led to this single, breathtaking point. He wanted me, and I wanted him. The simplicity of it, the sheer, unvarnished truth, was enough to make me dizzy. He didn't move, didn't rush. He held my gaze, his hand still warm against my jaw, giving me a silent moment to process, to be sure. It was another act of profound respect, of granting me space even in this moment of intense intimacy. His eyes were dark with a desire that was mirrored, I knew, in my own. But beneath it was a tenderness, a question. "Are you sure?" "I am sure." I leaned in, closing the small distance between us. My movement was a conscious choice, a clear and undeniable answer. His eyes fluttered shut, and he met me halfway. The first touch of his lips was soft, hesitant. It wasn't a kiss of demanding passion, but one of discovery, of confirmation. It was a question and an answer all at once. His lips were firm and warm, and they tasted faintly of the black coffee he always drank in the afternoons. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, a shaky sigh of pure, unadulterated relief. This was right. It felt more right than anything I had ever known. He responded to my sigh with a soft murmur, a sound deep in his chest. His other hand came up to my waist, his fingers splaying against my back, pulling me gently closer until our bodies were flush against each other. The kiss deepened, becoming more confident, more certain. It was unhurried, a slow, deliberate exploration. It spoke of patience, of a longing that had been held in check for what felt like an eternity. I slid my hands from his chest up to his shoulders, my fingers curling into the soft fabric of his shirt. I could feel the solid muscle beneath, the steady, grounding presence of him. The world outside this room, the city, Mistress Gable, my past failures, my uncertain future, it all faded away, leaving only this. The scent of old books and his cologne, the warmth of his body against mine, the incredible, unbelievable feeling of his lips moving with mine. He broke the kiss slowly, resting his forehead against mine. We stood there for a long moment, just breathing each other in. My eyes were closed, and I was trying to commit every sensation to memory. The slight roughness of his evening stubble against my skin, the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against my chest, the way his thumb was now drawing slow, soothing circles on my back. "Leo," he whispered, his voice thick and raspy. I opened my eyes. His were only inches from mine, and they were filled with an emotion so raw and open it stole my breath. The fortress was gone. The walls were rubble. It was just Julian, and he was looking at me as if I were the most precious thing he had ever held. I was so afraid, he admitted, his voice barely audible. Afraid of pushing you. Afraid of this. He gestured to the space between us, the difference in our lives, being too much. A cage instead of a comfort. It's not a cage, I said, my voice fierce with conviction. I laced my fingers with his, my hand feeling small and slight in his larger one. It's a foundation. You built a foundation, Julian. You gave me a safe place to stand. You let me choose to walk toward you. A look of profound relief crossed his face. He brought our joined hands up and pressed a soft kiss to my knuckles. The gesture was so tender, so full of unspoken promises, that my throat tightened. I've wanted this, he said, his gaze dropping to our intertwined fingers. From the day you walked into my study, looking so lost and so determined all at once. I wanted to tear up more than just your lease. I wanted to tear up every doubt you had about yourself. The confession undid me. To know that he had seen me, truly seen me, in that moment of my deepest shame and had felt not pity, but attraction, it was a gift. It was a healing balm on a wound I hadn't even known was still so raw. I think, I said, my voice a little unsteady. I've been falling for my landlord since the day I moved in. A small, genuine smile touched my lips. The mysterious, quiet man in the penthouse. He chuckled, the sound a warm vibration that I felt through his chest. And I've been falling for the quiet, serious young man on the 7th floor who always seemed to be carrying a book. It was all out in the open now. The mutual pining, the unspoken feelings, the fear of rejection. Laid bare in the dusty, quiet library, it was no longer a source of tension, but a shared history. The beginning of our story. He leaned in and kissed me again, and this time there was no hesitation. It was a kiss of certainty, of arrival. It was the consummation not of a physical act, but of a feeling that had been slowly, carefully, beautifully built between us. It was home. It was the quiet, steady click of a long-locked door finally swinging open. The morning after was strange. I woke up in my own bed, in my own apartment, but the world felt fundamentally altered. The sunlight filtering through my window seemed warmer, the air cleaner. The silence of the apartment was no longer a weight, but a peaceful space filled with the memory of the night before. After that second kiss, we hadn't rushed into anything more. We had simply held each other for a long time, talking in low voices as the sun set outside the library window. He had walked me to the spiral staircase, and at the door to my own floor, he had kissed me goodnight. A chaste, sweet press of his lips that was filled with more promise than any act of passion could have been. He was being careful of me. But now, in the cool light of day, a familiar tendril of anxiety began to creep in. Was it real? Had I imagined the depth of emotion in his eyes? Now that the confession was made, would the reality of our differences come crashing back down? I was still the younger man with no job and no prospects, living in his building. He was still the wealthy, powerful man who held all the cards. The kiss hadn't changed those facts. I went up to the library at 9 o'clock, just as I always did. The routine felt important, a solid thing to hold on to in the midst of my emotional turmoil. The penthouse was quiet. Julian's study door was closed. A pang of disappointment, sharp and swift, went through me. I told myself it was for the best. We needed space. We needed to figure out what this new landscape looked like. Down in the library, a single white orchid in a simple ceramic pot sat on my work table. Next to it was a thermos of coffee and a small paper bag from the bakery down the street. There was no note. There didn't need to be. It was his way of being present without crowding me. A gesture that said, "I'm thinking of you. What happened last night was real, but I respect your space." The thoughtfulness of it, the quiet, perceptive care, eased the knot of anxiety in my stomach. He understood. He wasn't going to smother me or assume anything. He was going to let me find my footing. I spent the morning working, my mind only half on the task. I kept listening for his footsteps on the stairs, but they never came. Around noon, my phone buzzed. It was a text from him. Lunch. The Gilded Spoon. 12:30. It was simple, direct. A public place. Neutral ground. It was another smart, considerate move. I texted back a single word. Yes. Walking into the small cafe, I felt a tremor of nerves. He was already there, sitting at a small table in the corner, nursing a bottle of water. He stood when he saw me, and the small, genuine smile he gave me sent a wave of warmth through my body. chasing away the last of my morning after unease. He looked happy. The sight of it was a revelation. "Hi," I said, my own smile feeling a little shy. "Hi," he said, his voice low and warm. He pulled out my chair for me, a small, old-fashioned courtesy that felt incredibly endearing. Once we had ordered, an awkward silence fell between us. I stirred my water with a straw, suddenly unsure of what to say. All the easy conversation we'd had while building shelves seemed to have vanished. Julian, as always, seemed to sense my discomfort. He reached across the table and laid his hand over mine. His touch was warm and steady. "Leo," he said, his gaze direct and unwavering. "I know this is new and potentially complicated. I don't want you to feel pressured or uncertain. Nothing has to change unless we both want it to." "I want things to change," I said immediately, the words surprising me with their own certainty. "I'm just worried." "About what?" he asked gently. "About the optics," I said, gesturing between us. "About the power dynamic. I don't want to be your project, Julian. I don't want to be the boy you saved." He squeezed my hand, his expression serious. "You were never that. You were a man facing a difficult situation with dignity. I offered you a professional opportunity that you were uniquely qualified for. You saved yourself, Leo. All I did was open a door you were already perfectly capable of walking through." His words were a balm. He saw my agency, my strength. He wasn't taking credit for my survival. "But what happens when the project is done?" I asked, voicing my deepest fear. "The contract ends. My reason for being here, it's gone." "Is that the only reason you're here?" he asked, his eyebrow raised in a gentle challenge. "No," I said softly. "It's not." "Then we will find a new reason," he said simply, as if it were the easiest thing in the world. "Perhaps one that doesn't involve a contract at all." He paused, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. "I have no interest in being your employer, Leo. Not anymore. I am far more interested in something else." The waitress arrived with our food, and he reluctantly let go of my hand. The absence of his touch was a palpable loss. We ate in a more comfortable silence, the big, scary conversation out of the way. We were left with the quiet reassurance of his words. He wanted more. He wanted to build something new, together. After lunch, as we walked back toward the building, he stopped me on the sidewalk. The city bustled around us, but in that moment, it felt like we were in our own private bubble. "I have a proposal," he said, a faint, teasing light in his eyes. "Another one?" I asked, my lips quirking into a smile. "Does this one also involve a dusty library and a questionable amount of manual labor?" He chuckled. "No, this one is far less formal." He grew serious again. "The library project will be finished in a few weeks. Your work has been exemplary. After that, I would like to hire you as the permanent curator for the collection, not as a temporary contractor, but as a salaried employee with benefits and a pension. You would manage the collection, oversee its preservation, and handle any acquisitions. The work could be done from anywhere. You would not need to be in the building." He was offering me a career, a real, stable future, and he was simultaneously offering me my independence. He was untangling our professional and personal lives before they could become knotted together, preserving my freedom of choice. "And separately from that," he continued, his voice dropping a little lower, completely unrelated to any employment decision you make, "I would like to take you on a proper date. A real date. Dinner, maybe a concert. Somewhere that is not in this building. Somewhere we can just be two men, getting to know each other." He was laying it all out, clear and transparent. Two distinct offers. One for my professional life, one for my personal life. I could accept one, or both, or neither. The power was entirely mine. Tears welled in my eyes, and I blinked them back, overwhelmed by the depth of his care, his thoughtfulness. He hadn't just heard my fears. He had created a practical, tangible solution to every single one of them. "I would like that," I said, my voice thick. "Both of those things. I would like that very much." A slow, brilliant smile spread across his face. He reached out, and, right there on the busy city sidewalk, he gently cupped my cheek. He didn't care who saw. He leaned in and pressed a soft, brief kiss to my lips. It was a public declaration, a quiet but firm rebuttal to any gossip or speculation. "This is real," the kiss said. "This is ours." We made a conscious choice, standing on that sun-drenched sidewalk. We chose to move forward, together, with care and intention. The path ahead wasn't entirely clear, but for the first time, it felt like a shared one. Our first date was a week later. Julian took me to a small, quiet Italian restaurant in a neighborhood I'd never been to, a place where no one knew him. He didn't arrive in a town car. He drove himself in a modest, dark sedan. He wore a simple, well-tailored blazer and an open-collared shirt. He was deliberately shedding the symbols of his wealth, meeting me on as level a playing field as he could create. It was easy, so incredibly easy. Away from the loaded context of our building, of our professional arrangement, we were just two people. We talked for hours, about everything and nothing. About his childhood summers spent on his grandfather's sailboat, about my chaotic family dinners growing up. He had a surprisingly sharp wit, and I found myself laughing more than I had in years. I saw a side of him that was hidden away in the penthouse, a lighter, more relaxed Julian who was curious and engaging and genuinely interested in every word I said. He listened. That was the thing that struck me the most. He listened with an intensity that made me feel like I was the only person in the world. He asked thoughtful questions. He remembered small details I'd told him weeks ago. He made me feel seen and heard and valued. At the end of the night, he drove me back to the building. He walked me to the door of my apartment, not his. I had a really good time, Julian, I said, the words feeling inadequate to express the depth of my happiness. So did I, he said, his voice soft. He cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs stroking my cheeks. More than I have in a very long time. He kissed me, a slow, deep kiss filled with all the warmth and promise of the evening. It was a kiss that felt like a beginning. Good night, Leo, he whispered against my lips. Good night, I whispered back. The next morning, a Saturday, I woke up feeling light and hopeful. I made myself coffee and sat by my window, watching the city come to life. A little while later, there was a soft knock on my door. It was Julian. He was holding 2 coffee mugs and had a hopeful, slightly shy expression on his face. He was dressed in comfortable sweatpants and a t-shirt, his hair still slightly damp from a shower. I made too much coffee, he said, a poor but endearing excuse. And I was wondering if you might have any breakfast to go with it. My fridge is a wasteland of good intentions and expired yogurt. I laughed, a real happy sound. My culinary skills are legendarily bad, but I think I can manage toast. Toast sounds perfect, he said, his smile reaching his eyes. I let him in, and he followed me into my small, simple kitchen. He set the mugs on the counter and leaned against it, watching me as I put bread in the toaster. My apartment, which had once felt like a symbol of my solitary, precarious life, suddenly felt different, warmer. With him in it, it felt like a home. He looked around, taking in the small space, the second-hand furniture, the stacks of books on every available surface. He didn't look with judgment or pity. He looked with interest, as if he were learning something new and important about me. I like your apartment, he said quietly. It feels like you. It's small, I said with a shrug. It's not about the size of the space, he said, his gaze meeting mine. It's about the life that's lived in it. The toast popped, and I buttered it, my hands feeling clumsy under his warm gaze. I handed him a plate, and we stood there in my little kitchen, eating toast and drinking coffee in a comfortable, domestic silence. It was the most intimate, the most real moment we had ever shared. It wasn't a grand, romantic gesture. It was something better. It was the quiet, unassuming beginning of a life together. Later, we sat on my lumpy sofa, our shoulders pressed together, the empty coffee mugs on the floor. The morning sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It was peaceful. It was perfect. I've been thinking, Julian said, breaking the silence. He took my hand, his fingers lacing with mine. About the future. I held my breath. My apartment is too big for one person, he said. It's quiet and lonely, and my toast-making skills are even worse than yours. He turned to look at me, his gray eyes soft and full of a quiet, steady love. I was wondering if you might consider making it a little less quiet, a little less lonely. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't an assumption. It was a question, an invitation. I looked around my small apartment, the place that had been my sanctuary, my prison, and my starting point. I had come here to rebuild my life, and I had. But the life I had built was no longer confined to these 4 walls. It was intertwined with the man sitting next to me. My home wasn't a place anymore. It was a person. I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The fear and shame of holding that lease, the terror of walking into his penthouse, the slow, cautious dance of getting to know each other, the thrill of that first kiss in the dusty library. The difference in our ages, in our wealth, it hadn't been a barrier. It had been the context for our story. His resources had created the opportunity, but my work, my choice, my heart, that had built the connection. We had created an equal partnership, not through a balance of finances, but through a balance of care, respect, and mutual consent. I was no longer the lost, frightened man who had been adrift. I was steady. I was grounded. I was loved. I brought his hand to my lips and kissed his knuckles. I looked into his warm, patient eyes. "Julian," I said, my voice clear and certain. "I think I would like that very much." His smile was like the sunrise. Share your thoughts in the comments. What moment stayed with you? If the story resonated, a like helps others find it. Subscribe for more slow burn male/male love stories told with warmth and care.